She had been sold once before, traded like a lame horse by the very people who should have loved her. Now, standing in the dust and heat of a frontier auction, Eleanor Whitmore carried every scar of that past in the leather pouch pressed against her ribs. She asked for nothing but invisibility. Then a dangerous man opened his mouth and the whole town laughed, and something ancient and iron-cold shifted behind her quiet eyes. She did not cry. She did not run. She made a decision that would change everything for him, for her, and for the broken land between them. Stay until the end. You will understand why some people are not meant to be broken. The town of Harlan Crossing had a way of cooking everything alive in July. The earth, the patience of men, the last thin hope that tomorrow might arrive with a cooler wind. By 10:30 in the morning, the sun had already turned the auction yard into something resembling the inside of a Dutch oven, and the smell of livestock sawdust and unwashed ambition hung over the crowd like a low ceiling that nobody could reach up and push away. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the back of that crowd. She was not a woman who announced herself. She had spent the better part of 34 years learning the particular art of disappearing in plain sight, and she had become very good at it. Her dress was the color of old creek water, faded and honest in its poverty. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. Her frame was full and solid, the kind of body that carried weight, the way old timber carries the memory of wind, not gracefully, not apologetically, simply as a matter of fact. She stood with her arms at her sides and her eyes moving quietly across the auction board, the way a chess player reads a board before the other person even sits down. Nobody paid her any attention. That was precisely the point. The heavy leather pouch beneath her bodice pressed warmly against her ribs. She was aware of its weight, the way a person is aware of a healed wound, constantly, quietly, without drama. The money inside represented 11 years of labor, of careful silence, of going without, so that one day she might go toward something instead. It was not a fortune by the standards of the men in silk vests who lounged near the auctioneer's platform. But it was everything she had, and it had cost her more than money could measure. She was here for a workhorse, a practical animal, plain and unbothered, something that would draw no attention. The kind of horse a poor drifter woman might buy without anyone wondering too long about where she came from or where she was headed. She had identified a gray gelding on the morning's roster, 12 years old, a little swayback, but sound in the hooves and steady in the eyes. A forgettable horse. A perfect horse. She was watching the gelding shift in its pen when the yard changed. The change moved through the crowd the way a cold current moves through warm water, sudden, startling, invisible until you were already inside it. Men who had been slouched against fence posts straightened. Women who had been fanning themselves with their auction programs went still. The low murmur of commerce dried up and was replaced by something raw, something that had the metallic edge of collective unease. Cole Maddox was being walked across the yard. He wore the evidence of his capture without any apparent shame. 3 days of trail dust, a split lip that had gone the color of a bruised plum, and wrists bound before him with rope that had been tied by men who were absolutely certain they wanted it to hold. But the rope was the only thing about him that suggested containment. He moved with the unhurried proprietary stride of a man crossing his own floor, which was a remarkable achievement, considering he was being escorted by 2 deputies who looked as though they wished they were somewhere else entirely. Cole Blackspur Maddox was, depending on who you asked, either a brutal outlaw or a devastating legend. And the difference between those 2 descriptions had more to do with proximity than with facts. He was built along the lines of something carved rather than born, broad through the shoulder, lean in the jaw, with black eyes that moved across a crowd the way a hawk moves across a field of tall grass, cataloging, measuring, calculating the distance to the nearest vulnerability. He was perhaps 38. He looked like a man who had used all 38 of those years to their full, complicated extent. The U.S. Marshal walking 3 steps behind him had a folder of legal documents under his arm and the expression of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary chore. Cole Maddox had been apprehended 2 weeks prior on federal warrants that spanned 3 territories. His assets, the ranch, the horses, the equipment, all of it had been seized by order of the territorial court. Today, those assets were being sold at public auction to settle a portion of what the law said he owed. Nell watched Cole walk across the yard. She watched the crowd part for him like water parts for a stone thrown into it. And she noted the particular quality of the fear the crowd carried. It was not the fear of a man in chains. It was the fear of a man who happened to be in chains today, with the unspoken understanding that chains were a temporary condition and Cole Maddox was not. She made herself look away and turned her attention to the auction board. Her eyes moved down the morning's roster in the methodical, unhurried way she did most things. The gray gelding, 3 plow mules, a set of wagon wheels, and then at the bottom of the board, partially obscured by the sun angle and the shadow of the auctioneer's platform, a property listing. She read it twice. She read it a 3rd time very slowly, the way you read something when your brain insists there must be a mistake. The Black Spur Ranch, approximately 840 acres, deeded grazing rights to the Southern Creek Basin. Timber access, a main house, a bunkhouse. 2 outbuildings, 1 functioning well. Estimated value by the territorial assessor, $4,200. Starting bid, $900. $900 for 840 acres of some of the most fertile rangeland in the territory. Nell stood very still for a moment. Inside her chest, something that was not quite excitement and not quite fear made itself known. A kind of clarifying electricity, the feeling she got sometimes when a problem that had seemed impossibly complicated suddenly revealed the clean geometry of its solution. She understood immediately why the price was so low. She looked at Cole Maddox, standing at the edge of the livestock pen with his bound wrists held loosely before him and his black eyes sweeping the crowd, and she understood exactly why not a single man in Harlan Crossing with the means to buy that ranch would do so. You did not buy the home of a man like Cole Maddox and expect to enjoy it in peace. The outlaw would be out of federal custody eventually, perhaps in a year, perhaps in 2. And when he came back, and everyone in this yard believed with absolute certainty that he would come back, you did not want to be the person sleeping in his house. The fear of the man was worth more to him than any fence or padlock. It had effectively rendered his most valuable asset unbiddable. Nell tilted her head very slightly the way she did when she was working through a calculation. She thought about the federal warrant timeline, which she knew something about because she had spent 3 careful weeks in the Territory Land Office reading documents before she ever showed up at this auction. She thought about the assessed value versus the starting bid. She thought about the creek basin and the timber access and the well. She thought about the 11 years of careful grinding labor that sat against her ribs in a leather pouch. She was still thinking when the livestock auction commenced and the auctioneer called the first lot. The horses went in sequence. A pair of working quarter horses, 2 mares, a young colt that had the crowd's brief admiring attention for 30 seconds before it was sold and forgotten. And then the auctioneer, a barrel-shaped man named Purvis who wore the same vest every day, regardless of temperature, called the next lot in his booming, rolling cadence. Lot 7, 1 black stallion, 6 years old, 17 hands sound in all 4, known to some of you gentlemen as Black Spur's personal mount. She's a beauty, folks. Who'll start me at 200? The stallion came out of the holding pen, and the crowd made a sound. The animal was extraordinary in the uncomplicated, immediate way that certain things are extraordinary. A perfect storm, a burning building, a piece of music that arrives in your chest before your brain has processed the notes. He was black from nose to tail with the exception of 4 white stockings that looked as though they had been painted on by someone with a very steady hand, and he moved with the particular coiled economy of a horse that knew its own power and had made a private agreement with itself about when to use it. "200, said a man near the front. "250, said another. Nell had not intended to bid on the stallion. The stallion was not practical. The stallion was the opposite of invisible. And yet she found her hand going up almost before she was aware of making the decision, responding to something that bypassed the part of her brain that made careful plans and went directly to the part that had been silent and careful and practical and invisible for 11 consecutive years. 300 from the lady in the back, Purvis called. The yard went briefly oddly quiet. It was Cole Maddox who broke the silence. He had been standing at the edge of the livestock pen watching the auction with the remote expression of a man at his own funeral present, in body entirely elsewhere in spirit. But when Purvis called out the bid and gestured toward the back of the crowd, Cole turned and located Nell with the immediate targeting precision that seemed to be simply how his eyes worked. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her threadbare dress and her sensible hat, and the solid, unfashionable weight of her standing there at the back of the crowd with her hand in the air. And then, in a voice that was not particularly loud, but carried across the yard the way a rifle shot carries across an open valley, clearly, flatly, with no echo and no apology, he said, "No fat woman rides my horse." The laughter came in waves. It came from the men leaning on the fence posts who were grateful for any distraction from the heat. It came from the merchants who had always found Cole Maddox terrifying and discovered now, with the particular relief of the bully's audience, that they could be on his side even in chains. It came from people who were not cruel by nature, but who laughed because laughter is contagious, and the alternative was to stand quietly in the discomfort of having witnessed something ugly, and that requires a particular kind of moral courage that most people in most crowds tend to misplace. Nell felt the laughter land on her the way a physical thing lands. She felt the heat in her face that had nothing to do with July. She felt the specific, precise pain of public humiliation, that particular combination of exposure and helplessness, and the terrible knowledge that everyone present is looking at you, and she stood in the middle of it, and she did not move. She had felt this before. She knew its dimensions. She knew exactly how far down it went, and she knew from long experience that she could survive the full depth of it and come back up breathing. She let her hand drop slowly. She swallowed once. Her face did not crumble. It did not perform outrage or dissolve into tears or attempt the complicated social rescue operation of laughing along. It simply went still the way water goes, still under ice. Whatever was moving in her expression pulled itself down below the surface, and the surface became glass. Her eyes left Cole Maddox entirely, not because she was retreating from him, because she was done with him as a factor in her calculations. She moved her gaze to the auction board and looked at the property listing at the bottom, and the number $900 sat in her mind with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty room. The auctioneer, who was a practical man with an auction to run, cleared his throat and resumed. The bidding on the stallion climbed. Nell did not re-enter it. She stood at the back of the crowd with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the board, and the heat pressed down on everyone equally, and the laughter faded, the way laughter always fades, quickly, completely, leaving nothing behind it to prove it had ever been anything other than air. Cole Maddox watched her from the corner of his eye for the rest of the livestock auction. She didn't know that. She was not looking at him. But she would learn it later, much later, and by then it would mean something different than it would have meant today. The stallion sold to a rancher from the Northern Valley for $480. The rest of the livestock moved through the roster. The crowd thinned in the afternoon heat, men drifting toward the saloon or the shade of the covered market. The particular urgency of the morning dissolving into the slow, sticky languor of a July afternoon in a town that was not large enough to have anywhere cool to go. Nell stayed where she was. She stayed as the yard emptied. She stayed as the deputies led Cole Maddox back toward the jailhouse, and she watched him go with the same quiet, calculating attention that she might have given to a column of figures that didn't quite add up. She stayed as Purvis the auctioneer rolled down his canvas sign and counted his receipts and mopped his face with a handkerchief the size of a small flag. She stayed until she was certain of her numbers. Then she found the land office deputy who was managing the property auction roster and confirmed that the Black Spur Ranch listing would go to bid at 7 o'clock the following morning. "Yes, ma'am," the deputy said with the careful, neutral politeness of a man who had no idea what he was talking to. "Thank you," Nell said, and walked back to the boarding house where she was paying 35 cents a night for a room that was smaller than the closet in the house where she had grown up, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the failing afternoon light and counted her money and ran her calculations and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked, if you tilted your head a little, like the outline of a river valley. She slept surprisingly well. She was at the land office at 6:30 in the morning, waiting on the steps when the deputy arrived with his keys. She was the first registered bidder. She was, when the gavel came down at 7:42 in the morning, the only bidder. The room in the land office was small and smelled of paper and dust and the particular mustiness of legal documents that had been handled by many anxious hands. There were 4 town bosses present, men who served on the township council and who had been eyeing the Black Spur property for months with the contained patient greed of men who knew a bargain when they saw one and who had been certain, absolutely certain, that no one else in the territory was foolish enough or brave enough or sufficiently insulated from common sense to actually bid on Cole Maddox's seized land. They sat in a row on the office's wooden bench with the expressions of men who had arrived at a card game to find the deck had been arranged before they got there. Purvis called the lot. He gave the legal description, the acreage, the assessed value. He opened at $900. Nell set her leather pouch on the land office counter, unfastened the strap, and said in the quiet, clear voice she used for transactions, $1,300, cash, for the property, the outbuildings, and the deeded grazing rights as listed in the territorial assessment. Purvis blinked. The 4 town bosses exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. "Do I hear 1,400? Purvis asked in the voice of a man who already knew the answer. The bench was silent. "Sold, said Purvis, and brought down his gavel, and Eleanor Whitmore became the legal owner of 840 acres of frontier rangeland. 1 main house, 1 bunkhouse, 2 outbuildings, 1 functioning well, and the deeded grazing rights to the Southern Creek Basin. She signed her name in the land office register with the unhurried, practiced hand of a woman who had been signing her own name to things for as long as she could remember, even when no one had asked her to, even when doing so served no immediate practical purpose. The habit of claiming herself on paper had started when she was 17 years old and had never stopped. The 4 town bosses left without speaking to her. She watched them go and noted with the precise, unemotional clarity that was her particular gift that their silence was not the silence of acceptance. It was the silence of men who were recalibrating. They would not help her. They would not actively oppose her because she had the law on her side, and they were at their core men who operated within the law when the law was the path of least resistance. But they would watch, and they would wait, and they would be pleased if she failed, and they would do nothing to prevent the failure. She collected her receipt, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the now considerably lighter leather pouch. She walked out of the land office into the morning light that was already gathering its heat for another assault on the valley, and she stood on the step for a moment with her face turned toward the direction of the ranch she had just purchased, 8 miles south. She had ridden past it twice on her reconnaissance, sitting on the back of a rented horse that was not the gray gelding, and looking at the fence lines and the pasture and the house that sat back from the road at the end of a long straight track between two rows of dying cottonwood trees. She had looked at it the way you look at a thing you are deciding whether to believe in. She believed in it now. It was hers. What she had not fully anticipated, or perhaps what she had calculated and set aside as a problem to solve when it arrived, was Cole Maddox. She heard about it from the boarding house owner, a thin-lipped woman named Mrs. Halsey, who delivered news the way she delivered meals quickly and without decoration. Cole had been formally served with the notice of sale that morning. He had been ordered by the marshal to vacate the property within 24 hours. He had listened to the deputy read the legal notice aloud, and then he had said 3 words that the deputy reported with the shaken precision of a man repeating something he had heard in a nightmare. "I don't leave." He had not resisted arrest or violated any term of his legal release conditions. He had simply walked south out of Harlan Crossing and established a camp on the side of the road approximately 4 feet outside the property line of the Black Spur Ranch in a shallow draw that offered minimal shelter and substantial visibility to anyone on the main road, and he had built a fire and was sitting next to it, waiting. Nell sat in her boarding house room and considered this information for approximately 15 minutes. She thought about the town bosses on their bench. She thought about the ranchers and cowboys she had approached that morning, 5 of them in conversations she had initiated carefully and professionally about employment on the new ranch. All 5 had found reasons to decline. One of them had been almost apologetic about it. The reason in each case was the same reason, and the reason was sitting 4 feet outside her property line next to a fire. She thought about the gray gelding she had not purchased, and the stallion she had not been allowed to ride, and the leather pouch that was lighter now by $1,300, and the land register with her name in it, and the pasture she had not yet walked, and the fence lines she had not yet repaired, and the house she had not yet slept in. She thought about what it would mean to have spent 11 years in careful accumulation and purchased at the end of it 840 acres that she could not operate alone and could not hire anyone to help her operate. Then she thought about the man sitting 4 feet outside her property line, who was not a man who would be moved by the law or by comfort or by reason delivered at a distance. He was a man who moved for things he understood: power, leverage, pride. She stood up, put on her hat, went to the stable, and rented the gray gelding, after all, because he was available. And she was not sentimental about the timing, and she rode south toward her property with a contract she had written herself in the slanted clear script she had developed in her years of managing accounts, folded in the pocket of her coat. She found Cole Maddox exactly where Mrs. Halsey had described him. He was sitting on a rock beside a small efficient fire, and he had a tin cup of coffee balanced on his knee, and he was looking at the main house of the ranch with an expression that had traveled so far past rage that it had come out the other side into something that looked almost like grief. His bound wrists had been replaced with the single ankle monitor that was the condition of his release, a heavy iron cuff attached to a chain that ended in a padlock worn loose enough that a man could walk but not run a legalized tether that the law considered sufficient, and Cole Maddox considered an insult. He looked up when she rode in. The expression didn't change. He simply looked at her with those black eyes that catalogued everything, and asked with that flat, unimpressed attention what she thought she was doing here. Nell dismounted. She tied the gelding to a branch that was clearly not on her property as a small private gesture of exactness. Then she walked to the edge of the fire, not to its center, not too close, the distance of a woman who has learned to read the geometry of dangerous situations and position herself accordingly, and she reached into her coat pocket and produced the contract. She held it out. Cole looked at the paper. He looked at her. He did not take it. "I'm going to say this once," Nell said. Her voice was the same voice she had used in the land office, clear level, not raised above the requirement of being heard. Nobody in Harlan Crossing will work for me as long as you are sitting here. You know that. And you are sitting here watching a stranger on your land because you believe I will fail and you will get it back." Cole said nothing. His jaw moved slightly the way a man's jaw moves when he is deciding whether a thing is worth the energy of a response. "You might be right," Nell said with the particular unsettling serenity of a person who has already thought through the worst outcomes and made her peace with them. "But you are also hungry and cold, and 2 days from freezing once the night temperature drops, and your coffee is the last you have, because I can see you have nothing else in that camp. And I have a bunkhouse and a cook stove, and I am offering you fair wages for ranch work, which you know how to do better than any man in the territory." She set the contract down on the rock beside him because he had not taken it from her hand. "Work for me," she said. "Get paid, or sit here and watch." The fire crackled between them. Somewhere up the draw, a night bird was beginning its early warm-up, a thin, tentative sound in the cooling afternoon air. Cole looked at the contract on the rock. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the house at the end of the cottonwood track, and the particular quality of his expression in that moment was the quality of a man conducting a violent internal argument in absolute silence. Then he picked up the contract. He read it. She could tell he was actually reading it, not performing the act of reading, but genuinely processing the terms which were straightforward and fair, and had been written without a single clause that could be construed as charitable. She had not offered him mercy. She had offered him an arrangement. The distinction was deliberate. He read it twice the way she had read the auction board. "You got a pen," he said. His voice was rough from the cold and from 3 days of speaking to no one, but it had the same flat carrying quality as the comment in the auction yard. It was a voice that had never needed to work very hard to be heard. "Yes," Nell said, and produced one from her coat pocket, because she was the kind of woman who kept a pen in her coat pocket. Cole Maddox signed his name at the bottom of the contract with the controlled, angular handwriting of a man who had taught himself his letters later in life and had developed a certain grim pride in the result. He handed the pen back without looking at her. "I'm not doing this because of you," he said. "I know," Nell said. "I'm doing this because it's my land and I intend to take it back." "I know that too," Nell said. She took the contract, folded it back into her pocket, and untied the gray gelding from the branch. "Bunkhouse is unlocked. Cook stove needs wood. I'll expect you at first light." She mounted the gelding and rode the 4 feet across the property line onto her land and down the long, straight track between the dying cottonwood trees toward the house that was hers. She did not look back. Behind her, Cole Maddox sat beside his fire for a long time in the cooling dusk, looking at nothing in particular and turning the pen cap she had left behind over and over in his fingers. Then he picked up his coffee, drank the last of it, and began the process of breaking camp. He was there at first light. Nell heard him before she saw him, which was how she suspected it would always be with Cole Maddox. The sound of the bunkhouse door, the particular weight of his boots on the hard-packed earth between the outbuildings, the way the silence of the early morning reorganized itself around his presence, the way water reorganizes around a stone dropped into it. She was already at the cook-stove heating water for coffee, still in the gray hour before sunrise when the valley held its breath and the cottonwood trees at the end of the track were nothing but dark suggestions against a darker sky. She had slept in the main house for the first time the night before. She had walked through every room in the failing light of the previous evening with a lamp held at shoulder height, taking inventory with the systematic thoroughness that was her nature. The house was solidly built, which she had expected from a man like Cole Maddox, who she suspected did very few things halfway. The walls were thick adobe and timber. The floors were swept clean planking, and the fireplace in the main room was large enough to heat the whole structure without complaint. But it had the quality of a house that had been lived in by a person who expected to be the only person in it. There were no soft edges anywhere, no concession to comfort beyond the purely functional. The single chair at the kitchen table sat at the precise center of the table, as though Cole had eaten every meal of his life alone and had arranged the furniture to reflect that fact without apology. Nell had pushed the chair to one side, sat down on the floor with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out before her, and eaten the bread and hard cheese from her saddlebag while she looked at the room that was now hers. She had done this, the sitting on the floor against the wall, since she was 12 years old. She found it easier to think without a chair underneath her, without the particular social scaffolding of furniture that had always seemed designed for a kind of person she had not been invited to become. She had thought clearly and at length. She had made lists in the small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket alongside the pen. She had written down what she knew, what she needed to know, what needed to be done first, second, and third. By the time the lamp burned low, she had a working plan for the first 2 weeks on the ranch, which she fully expected Cole to attempt to undermine in every way, short of the ones that would violate the contract he had signed. This was not pessimism. It was arithmetic. She poured a second cup of coffee when she heard his boots stop outside the kitchen door. There was a pause. The pause of a man deciding something about a threshold, and then he knocked. The knock was 3 hard, flat raps, the knock of a person who has never in their life needed to soften the announcement of their arrival. "It's open," Nell said. He came in, and the kitchen, which had seemed adequately sized the evening before, underwent an immediate adjustment. Cole Maddox in an outdoor setting was large. Cole Maddox in a kitchen was a different category of problem. He had to angle his shoulders slightly coming through the doorframe, and when he straightened, the ceiling seemed to have an opinion about the situation. He looked at the cook stove, the coffee the window with its square of early blue light. He looked at the chair she had pushed to the side of the table. He did not look at her directly, which she noted not as avoidance, but as the particular wariness of a man who has stepped into a space that used to be his and is working out the terms of how it is no longer his. "Coffee," Nell said, not as a question, and pushed the cup across the table. Cole sat down in the chair she had displaced, wrapping both hands around the cup with the instinctive pleasure of a man who has spent a cold night outside and has opinions about warm things. He drank. She stood at the stove with her own cup and consulted her notebook. "I need the south fence line assessed this morning," she said. "I need to know what it will take to make it cattle ready. I also need to know the condition of the well casing and whether the irrigation channel from the creek basin is operational or blocked." Cole said nothing for a moment. He turned the cup in his hands. "South fence runs 800 yards, he said finally, in the flat, reluctant tone of a man providing information to the enemy because the information happens to be accurate. 3 sections are down. Been down since February. The corner post at the ravine end needs resetting. The ground shifted in the spring thaw. And the creek channel partially blocked. Beaver Dam about 40 yards upstream from the intake. Been meaning to deal with it." He paused. "Been dealing with other things." He meant the federal warrant. He said it without any particular inflection, the way a man mentions the weather, and Nell accepted it the same way. "The Beaver Dam is first to," she said. "Fence second. If we can get water moving through the irrigation channel, I can assess what the lower pasture is worth for summer grazing." Cole set his cup down with a precise, controlled motion and looked at her for the first time since he had come through the door. His black eyes held the specific, evaluating attention of a man who had spent his adult life calculating the capabilities of the people around him, not out of cruelty, but out of a survival instinct that had never had the luxury of switching off. "You know anything about running cattle?" he asked. "I know how to run a business," Nell said. "I'll learn the rest." Something moved across his face. Not respect, not yet. Something more provisional than that, the flicker of a man encountering a fact that doesn't fit his existing arrangement of the world and deciding what to do with it. He pushed back the chair and stood up. "I'll start on the channel. he said, and walked back out the kitchen door without another word, setting his coffee cup down on the table with the same controlled precision as before. Nell watched him go through the window above the stove. She watched him cross the yard toward the tool shed, moving with that unhurried proprietary stride that seemed to be simply the way his body understood space. And she made a note in her leather notebook and then added water to the coffee pot and thought about the south fence line. The first week was a war conducted entirely in silence. Cole worked. She could not fault him for that. He worked with the focused, joyless efficiency of a man serving a sentence, which in a practical sense he was, though the sentence was one he had imposed on himself. He cleared the beaver dam from the irrigation channel in a single grueling day, working waist-deep in cold creek water with a methodical brutality that removed the obstruction root by root and branch by branch, and left the intake clear and the water moving south through the channel by late afternoon. He came in for supper without comment, ate the meal Nell had prepared, a straightforward beef stew, the kind of cooking she had always done, plain and adequate, and entirely without the ambition to impress, and went to the bunkhouse. He did not say it was good. He did not say anything. He ate it completely and set the bowl on the counter beside the stove on his way out, which Nell took as the equivalent of a favorable review from a man who communicated primarily in actions. The fence line took 3 days. Cole set the corner post at the ravine end with a precision that spoke of long familiarity with the particular obstinance of that specific ground, tamping the earth around the new post with the steady, patient force of a man who has reset this particular post before and knows exactly what it requires. Nell worked the opposite end of the fence line, running new wire between posts that were sound, her hands in leather work gloves that were a size too large and slid around her fingers in ways that were inefficient but manageable. She did not ask Cole for technique. She watched him from a distance when she needed to understand something and then applied what she had observed. Cole watched her watch him. She knew this too, with the peripheral awareness of a woman who had spent her life being looked at in ways she was not meant to notice. But his watching now had a different quality than the auction yard. It was the watching of a man conducting an involuntary, ongoing study of something he had assigned to one category and keeps finding reasons to reassign. He never helped her. Not with the wire, not with the posts. Not when a section of fencing she was working collapsed back on itself and the barbed wire caught her forearm through the coat, and she stood still for a long moment with her eyes closed and her teeth pressed together until the initial bright flare of pain subsided to something navigable. She dealt with it herself, re-rolled the wire, and kept working. She felt his eyes from 50 yards away, and she kept working. The rest of the town maintained its careful, watchful distance. Purvis from the auction yard rode past the property twice in those first days, both times, slowing his horse to look down the cottonwood track toward the main house, both times riding on without stopping. The 4 town bosses from the land office made no move toward the ranch in any direction. Nell had gone back to Harlan Crossing on the 3rd day for supplies, riding the gray gelding through town at the same unhurried pace. She did everything, and she had felt the town's attention on her like a physical pressure, not hostile exactly, but weighted with the particular anticipatory quality of a crowd watching a high-wire act, waiting to see whether the fall, which they considered inevitable, would be spectacular or merely sad. She bought flour salt dried beans, lamp oil, and a new pair of work gloves that fit. She conducted each transaction with the same clear, neutral efficiency she brought to everything. She did not engage with the scrutiny. She loaded her purchases into her saddlebag and rode back south, and the cottonwood trees at the end of the track were casting afternoon shadows by the time she returned, and Cole was in the yard doing something productive and silent with a length of harness leather, and neither of them acknowledged the other's presence for a full 5 minutes, which was its own kind of communication. It was on the 8th day that Cole made his first deliberate move. She found it in the morning going over the ranch accounts at the kitchen table with her notebook and the previous records she had inherited with the property. Cole had ordered in the weeks before his arrest a significant quantity of lumber for what the invoice described as repairs to the main house roof. The lumber had been delivered and paid for, and the roof repairs had not been completed, and the lumber was stacked in one of the outbuildings. Nell had noted this in her first inventory and had added it to the list of tasks. What she found on the 8th morning was the invoice gone from the property records file and replaced with a different document handwritten that claimed the lumber had been ordered on credit from a Harlan Crossing merchant and was still owed. The amount listed was $230. She sat very still for a moment looking at the document. Then she went to the outbuilding and looked at the lumber. She went back to the kitchen and went through the property records again, carefully and completely, until she found the original paid invoice tucked behind a different folder, where it had no reason to be unless someone had moved it there. She set both documents side by side on the table and looked at them, and then she looked at the window above the stove through which she could see the corner of the bunkhouse in the morning light. She could go to the marshal. She had grounds. The contract she had written included a clause about the deliberate falsification of property records because she had anticipated exactly this kind of maneuver from a man who was too proud to sabotage her with anything as crude as broken equipment or stolen supplies. She had anticipated something clever, something that would exploit the gap between what was legal and what was provable, something that a certain kind of man would consider a fair fight. She did not go to the marshal. She picked up both documents and walked to the bunkhouse and knocked on the door. The same 3 flat raps he had used on her kitchen door. She heard him cross the floor, and the door opened, and he stood there fully dressed, with the alert, ready stillness of a man who had spent enough time as a fugitive that he did not move slowly in the mornings, regardless of circumstances. She held out both documents without speaking. He looked at them. His face did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. "I found the original invoice," Nell said. Her voice was the same voice she always used, the voice that did not rise or fall with what she was feeling, because what she was feeling was not relevant to the conversation she was having. "I want you to understand something, Cole. I am not going to fail. I am not going to make a mistake that lets you reclaim this land. I am not going to run out of money or patience or will. I have been underestimated by people with considerably more practice at it than you, and I am still here." Cole said nothing. "Try this again," she said. "And I will invoke the breach clause, and the marshal will remove you from the property, and you will spend the remainder of your release conditions in a boarding house in Harlan Crossing, watching the councilmen buy your cattle for pennies at the next auction. Do you understand me?" The silence held for a moment that was several degrees longer than comfortable. "Understood," Cole said. The word was flat and quiet, and contained nothing beyond its literal meaning. Nell took the fraudulent document back, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. She left the original invoice. She walked back to the main house and sat down at the kitchen table and sat there for a long time with her hands flat on the table in front of her, not shaking, just still. She allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Then she picked up her pen and her notebook and went back to work. Cole did not attempt anything of the kind again. She felt the change in the days that followed, not as warmth, which would have been too much to ask, but as the withdrawal of active opposition. He went from doing the bare minimum to doing the actual work, not because he had decided to be generous, but because she suspected he was a man who found it genuinely difficult to do something badly once he had decided to do it at all. The fence line he finished was a better fence line than the minimum contract required. The irrigation channel he had cleared ran clean and steady, and he had reinforced the intake with fieldstone in a way that had not been in any instruction she had given him. She noted this in her notebook and said nothing about it. He said nothing about the bunkhouse. Days moved into the second week, and the second week became the shape of something that was not yet ordinary, but had the faint structural outline of ordinary visible inside it. The cook stove in the mornings, the coffee on the table, the day's tasks assessed and distributed without ceremony. The work done in parallel, each on their own section, the gap between them maintained, like a demilitarized zone that both of them respected without ever having explicitly agreed to it. She learned things about the ranch that Cole had not told her because she had not asked and he had not volunteered. She learned them by walking the land systematically and on foot in the early mornings before he was working, and on the long summer evenings when the light stayed past 8 o'clock and the heat finally began to think about something else. She walked the creek basin and the timber access, and the south pasture and the north pasture and the ravine at the edge of the south fence line, and she looked at all of it with the careful, unhurried attention she brought to every column of figures, every land record, every problem that rewarded patience more than speed. The land was extraordinary. She had known this from the assessor's report and the price differential, but knowing it on paper and knowing it on foot are different categories of knowing. The soil in the lower pasture was dark and deep and held moisture in a way that the desiccated land around Harlan Crossing simply did not, fed by the creek basin and protected from the worst of the summer wind by the timber ridge to the west. The grazing capacity properly managed was significantly higher than the previous operation had used. Cole had run the ranch for himself alone, which meant he had worked it to his immediate needs without considering what it might become under different ambitions. She was considering what it might become on a Thursday evening in the third week, sitting on the porch steps of the main house with her notebook and the long golden light of a summer evening laying itself across the pasture like something generous when Cole came around the corner of the house and stopped. He had not expected to find her there. She could tell this from the specific quality of the stop, which had the character of a man who has been moving with a private purpose and has suddenly found the space he expected to have to himself occupied by someone else. "I'm not in your way," Nell said without looking up from her notebook. Cole stood there for a moment. Then, without any particular decision apparent in his movement, he sat down on the porch step below the one she occupied. He had a length of rope in his hands that he had apparently been planning to work with some maintenance task she was not familiar with, and he started working it the way hands will work, a task that has become automatic, the fingers knowing what to do without requiring the attention of the person attached to them. They sat in the long evening light without speaking, and the valley below the property moved through its evening sounds. The creek and the birds and the distant peaceful noise of the cattle in the south pasture and the silence between them was not the hard silence of opposition. It was different from that. It was newer than that. It was the first silence they had shared that did not feel like a temporary suspension of hostilities. Neither of them commented on this. A week later the storm came. It came the way the worst storms in that territory always came, which was without sufficient warning, and with the particular deliberate intensity of weather that has decided it has a point to make. The morning had been hot, and still the sky, the flat white blue of an overheated day, and then, sometime around 2 in the afternoon, the horizon to the northwest developed the greenish bruised coloring that every rancher in the valley recognized and nobody liked to see. By 4 o'clock the wind had come up in hard, irregular gusts that carried the smell of the storm before it, that mineral electric smell of rain still an hour away but already committed to its arrival. Cole came in from the north pasture and looked at the sky. Nell was already on the porch looking at the same sky. They stood 20 feet apart and looked at the northwest horizon, and neither of them said anything because the sky was saying everything that needed to be said. "South fence," Cole said. "The ravine end," Nell said at the same moment. The corner post she had seen him reset. The ground that shifted in the spring thaw. The 800 yards of fence line that stood between the south pasture cattle herd and the ravine at the property's southern edge, a 40-foot drop into a dry creek bed that would, in another hour, no longer be dry. She was moving before he finished his thought, and he was moving before she finished hers, and they crossed the yard at the same hard pace without coordinating it, pulling gear from the tool shed, because they both understood independently what would be needed. Heavy rope and fence staples and the post maul and the wire cutters loading it into the wagon with the speed of people who have done this kind of work long enough to have no wasted movements. The storm arrived before they reached the south fence. The rain came sideways with the honest malice of a July storm that has had all day to gather its energy and is now prepared to spend it without restraint. The road to the south pasture turned to running mud under the wagon wheels inside of 3 minutes, and the gray gelding hitched to the wagon moved with the unhappy but committed resignation of an animal that has been in this situation before and knows from experience that the humans attached to it will insist on continuing regardless of the horse's opinion. They heard the cattle before they saw them. The sound of a panicked herd has a particular frequency, a low-rolling vocal emergency that carries through rain and wind in a way that bypasses the ears and lands directly in the chest, and Nell felt it before she consciously identified it, a tightening in her rib cage that was pure instinct in a body that was still in its deepest mechanics, an animal itself. The corner post had gone. She could see it in a flash of lightning, the post she had watched Cole reset with his methodical, patient force, lying flat in the mud, with its wire trailing behind it into the pasture. The 3 sections of fence at the ravine end were down, 2 of them bent flat by the post's failure, and through the gap she could see the herd moving in the wrong direction. 24 cattle pushed by the wind and their own fear toward the ravine edge, and the rain was making the footing treacherous in a way that would not spare any living thing that got too close to that drop. Cole jumped from the wagon before it fully stopped. He was in the mud and running toward the herd, angling to come at them from the side, to turn them, which was the right instinct, and she registered this while simultaneously taking stock of the fence. The gap needed to close. Without the post, the wire could still be held temporarily manually if someone was on the rope end and had the weight and the will to hold against the pressure of cattle being pushed back from the ravine toward the pasture. She knew what that required. She got the heavy rope from the wagon, found the end of the downed fence wire in the mud, and began working. The wire was barbed, and her work gloves were already soaked through, and her hands inside them had lost the precise dexterity that dry conditions allowed, and the wire knew this and punished her for it. The barbs, finding the gaps in the gloves as she worked to loop the rope through the fence wire and create a tension line she could hold. She felt the barbs go through. She kept working. Lightning hit the timber ridge to the west, a flat crack of sound that arrived at the same instant as the light, meaning it was close enough that the gray gelding screamed and pulled against the wagon traces, and Nell spoke to him without looking up from the wire, a stream of low, flat sound that was not words but was the frequency of a voice that means it is safe. It is here. It is not going anywhere. The horse stilled. She got the tension line secured, and she pulled. The weight of the wire and the pressure of the wind and the mud and the rain and her own soaked heavy clothing all registered simultaneously as a single compound fact about what the next minutes were going to require from her. And she answered that fact by planting her feet and pulling and holding and pulling again, inch by inch, working the gap in the fence, smaller the wire coming up from the mud. Gradually the tension line holding. She fell the first time after perhaps 8 minutes. The mud gave way under her boots, and she went down on one knee, and then fully into the mud, and the rope burned through her grip for a terrifying second before her hands closed on it again. The barbs of the fence wire, she had looped it through, translating directly into her palms through the saturated gloves, and she made a sound that was not a word and pulled herself up. She fell the second time after 12 minutes, This time she went fully down, face forward, one cheek in the mud, and the cold of the ground and the rain and the sheer indignity of the position hit her in a way that went past physical and arrived somewhere closer to the bone. She lay there for 1 second, 2 seconds, the rain driving into the back of her neck, the mud close and cold and immediate against her face, and she felt in those 2 seconds the complete, precise weight of everything that had brought her to this particular pasture in this particular storm. The years of silence and accumulation and careful planning that had ended here on her face in the mud alone. She got up. She did not get up gracefully. She got up the way a thing gets up that has no alternative, and has made its peace with the absence of alternatives, which is to say, badly and slowly and completely. She found the rope in the mud, and her hands found the grip, and she planted her feet, and she pulled again, and the tears on her face were indistinguishable from the rain on her face, which was how she preferred it. She did not hear him come through the storm. She became aware of him the way she became aware of most things, not all at once but in increments, the peripheral recognition of changed conditions. The tension on the rope altered. The resistance she had been pulling against alone became by some increment she could not immediately calculate less alone. She looked to her right, and Cole Maddox was in the mud beside her, his hands on the rope a foot from hers, his shoulder 5 inches from her shoulder pulling. He was not looking at her. His face was forward, jaw set, eyes on the fence line. He was simply there in the mud and the rain and the storm on the other end of what she was holding. No explanation, no commentary, no ceremony. They pulled together. The fence line came up from the mud in sections, the gap narrowing yard by yard, the tension line holding through what it had absolutely no physical reason to hold through, and Nell's hands had gone past pain into a territory her body had apparently reserved for exactly this kind of circumstance, which was a kind of high, clear functioning that asked nothing about comfort and concerned itself entirely with what was necessary. Cole matched her pull for pull, his weight and strength on the rope making the impossible merely very difficult, and they worked in silence because the storm was too loud for any voice to carry, and because nothing that could be said in words was as true as the rope between their hands. The last section came up. Cole drove a temporary stake into the ground with the post maul one-handed in the rain with a force that came from a place entirely beyond technique. Nell looped the rope around it twice and tied it, and they held it, and the fence held, and the gap was closed, and the cattle turned. By Cole's earlier run through the mud, were moving away from the ravine end toward the center of the pasture. They stood in the rain and the mud and breathed. The storm did not stop, but the thing that needed to be held was held, and the fence was up and the herd was safe, and the ravine was where it had always been, and the land on this side of it was still theirs. Cole's hands were on his knees. He was breathing with the deep, ragged concentration of a man who has gone past the comfortable edge of his physical limits and is accounting for the overage. Rain ran down his face, and he did not appear to notice it. He turned and looked at her. Not the auction yard look, not the evaluating look, not the proprietary look of a man assessing a space that used to belong to him. Something else, something that had no practiced quality to it at all, because some things happen to a person before they have the opportunity to develop a practiced response, and this was one of them. Nell looked back at him. Mud on her face and her hands bleeding through her gloves, and her hair entirely undone by the wind and rain, standing in the south pasture of the land she had bought with 11 years of careful silence in the storm she had not run from. She did not say anything. Neither did he. The rain came down around them, and the cattle moved in the pasture behind her, and the creek beyond the ravine was running high and fast, and audible, even through the storm, and none of that mattered particularly. What mattered was the rope between them still taut, still held, and the fact that when she had been in the mud alone, he had put his hands on the other end of it. Some things do not require words. Some things are already said by the time a person thinks to open their mouth. Cole Maddox straightened up in the rain and looked at the fence line they had held together, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man watching someone else's land survive a storm. It was the expression of a man who is beginning against every intention to understand where home is. They walked back to the house in the rain because there was nothing else to do. The storm had made its statement and was beginning grudgingly to retract it, the lightning moving east and the rain thinning from a driving curtain to a steady, purposeful fall that had accepted it could not maintain the earlier intensity indefinitely. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks in the mud on the return. The gray gelding walked without complaint, which Nell noted as a quality she respected in any living thing. Cole unhitched the horse and got him into the dry of the stable without being asked, because the horse needed it and because Cole Maddox was whatever else. He was a man who understood animals in the uncomplicated, fluent way of someone raised in their company. Nell went to the main house and built up the fire in the kitchen because the storm had dropped the temperature 15 degrees, and her hands needed warmth more than they needed anything else at that particular moment. She was at the kitchen table with a basin of water and a strip of clean cloth when Cole came through the door. He stopped when he saw her hands. The gloves were off, and the cuts from the barbed wire were what they were, not dramatic, but numerous, the kind of small, precise damage that accumulates below the threshold of attention until the attention is suddenly unavoidable. The water in the basin had gone pink. He sat down across from her without being invited and without asking. He reached across the table and took her right hand in both of his, and she let him, because her hands were not working as well as she needed them to, and because something in the matter-of-fact quality of the gesture made resistance feel beside the point. He was not gentle in the way that people are gentle when they are performing gentleness. He was careful in the way a person is careful with a thing they have decided matters, which is a different quality entirely. He cleaned the cuts without speaking. He had found the small medical kit she kept on the shelf above the dry goods, which meant he had looked for it, and he worked through her hands with the methodical, unsentimental competence of a man who had dressed wounds before his own and other people's, and had developed an approach to the work that was about function rather than comfort. It hurt in the specific, clarifying way that proper cleaning of barbed wire cuts hurts, and Nell sat still and let it hurt because hurting was accurate, and she had never seen the point in arguing with accurate things. "You should have asked me," Cole said. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at her hands. "You were turning the herd," Nell said. "You should have waited." The gap needed to close. He tied off the last strip of cloth around her palm and set her hand down on the table with a slowness that had nothing efficient in it. He looked at her, then directly the way he had looked at her in the pasture with the rain on his face, and the fence held between them and the kitchen was warm now from the fire, and the storm was settling into the ordinary sound of rain on a roof, and the light from the lamp threw everything into amber and shadow. "You are the most stubborn person I have ever known," he said. He said it without inflection, the way he said most things, which somehow made it more rather than less. "Yes," Nell said. He almost smiled. It did not complete itself into an actual smile, but it visited the vicinity of his face, which she suspected was about as close as Cole Maddox got on a regular basis. He stood up and picked up his hat from the table, which he had set down when he sat, and held it for a moment, turning it in his hands the way he had turned the pen cap that first night outside the property line. Then he said, without looking at her, "You held the fence." "We held the fence," Nell said. He put his hat on and went out back to the bunkhouse through the lessening rain, and Nell sat at the kitchen table with her bandaged hands flat on the table in front of her, and the fire speaking quietly behind her, and the basin of pink water going cool in the lamplight, and she sat there for a long time without moving, which was not inertia. It was the particular stillness of a person taking careful stock of a situation that has changed in ways that require a new set of calculations. She was not afraid of the change. She noted it with the same precise, neutral attention she brought to everything, and she noted that the neutrality was for the first time in a long time not entirely accurate. The days after the storm had a different quality, not softer exactly. The work was still the work, and the land made no concessions to the drama of human internal states. The fence line needed permanent repair, which required 2 full days of heavy post-work in ground that the rain had turned from concrete to something workable, and which would they both knew return to concrete the moment it dried. They worked the south fence together for those 2 days, Cole setting posts and Nell running wire, and the demilitarized zone between them had shifted its position, not gone, but renegotiated closer. Now the distance between them on the fence line, something less than the careful 20 feet of the previous weeks. Cole talked about the ranch. Not to her precisely, or not only to her, but in the way that a person talks when they are doing work they have always done, and the work calls up the knowledge attached to it. He talked about the South Pasture's soil and the way water moved through it, and what it would support through a dry August. He talked about the cattle, which were a mixed herd of his own selection, each animal known to him individually in the way that ranchers who pay attention know their stock, and his knowledge of them was specific and detailed and entirely without sentimentality, which Nell found more convincing than sentimentality would have been. She listened and wrote things in her notebook. She asked questions when she had them. Practical questions about yield and timing and the particular behaviors of the cattle under specific weather conditions, and he answered them with the same flat, reluctant accuracy he had brought to the first morning's conversation about the beaver dam. The accuracy of a man who finds it genuinely difficult to provide false information about things he actually knows. On the 3rd day after the storm, she found him at the paddock fence in the late afternoon, his arms crossed on the top rail, looking at the empty space where the black stallion had been before the auction. She did not say anything. She stood beside him at the fence, not touching it, and looked at the same empty space. He was bred in New Mexico, Cole said without preamble, as though continuing a conversation that had been happening somewhere she hadn't been. Took me 2 years to find the right bloodline, another year to train him. He wasn't broke. He was negotiated with. He paused. There's a difference. I know, Nell said. Cole looked at her sideways. You know horses. I know the difference between breaking and negotiating, she said. I've been on both ends of it. He was quiet for a moment. The evening light on the empty paddock was the particular gold of an hour before sunset, generous and a little melancholy, the way evening light in the territory tended to be, as though the day understood it was ending and had complicated feelings about it. Who broke you? Cole asked. He asked it the way he asked most things, without elaboration, the question standing alone, without the social scaffolding that usually surrounds a question of that size. Nell looked at the empty paddock. My father sold me to settle a debt, she said. I was 18. The man who bought me was not a violent person. He was something worse. He was indifferent. She said this with the same flat clarity with which Cole described cattle conditions and fence lines, the clarity of a person who has processed a thing so completely that it no longer requires protective distance. I worked in his household for 4 years. I kept the accounts because it turned out I was good at accounts and he was not, and good accounts are worth more than sentiment to a certain kind of man. When he died, he left me what he owed me in wages. It was $200. I took it and I left, and I did not stop until I had turned it into what I needed. Cole said nothing. His arms were still crossed on the top rail of the fence, and his face was toward the empty paddock, and nothing visibly moved in his expression. But something in the quality of his stillness was different from his ordinary stillness, which was the stillness of a self-contained person going about his internal business. This was the stillness of a man listening with something other than his ears. The man at the auction, he said. It was not a question. He meant himself. Yes, Nell said. Another silence. A longer one. I am not going to apologize, Cole said slowly. because an apology from me is not worth the air it travels on, and we both know it. But I want you to understand that what I said in that yard was not about you." Nell looked at him. "It was said to me," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was." He uncrossed his arms from the fence rail and looked at them, his own hands, for a moment. "I said it because I was standing in front of 200 people in chains, and I needed them to be afraid of something. I said it because the first target I found was you. And you were bidding on the one thing I had left that I gave a piece of myself to." He paused. "That is not a justification. It is an explanation. The difference matters to me, even if it doesn't matter to you." Nell considered this for a moment with the careful, precise attention she gave to all things that required it. "It matters to me," she said. "The difference." Cole looked at her, then the full direct look, and she held it without flinching, because she had learned a long time ago that the things worth having required you to hold still when everything in your history told you to look away. "My brother," Cole said, and stopped. He started again. "My brother was the one who turned me in for the federal warrant. There was a reward." He said it with the particular controlled flatness of a man speaking about a wound that has not finished hurting but has been thoroughly analyzed. "I had brought him into the operation because he had a family, and they were going hungry, and I believed that blood obligated me to that. He believed the reward obligated him to the opposite." He looked back at the empty paddock. "After that, I did not believe in much of anything except the land. The land does not make agreements it does not intend to keep." Nell stood beside him in the evening light and felt the weight of what he had said settle into the space between them, not as a burden, but as a fact which was the only way Cole Maddox appeared capable of delivering things. "My family believed I was defective," she said, "not broken, defective, as though I had come off a production line with the wrong specifications. Too large, too quiet, too interested in numbers when I should have been interested in becoming someone's wife." She paused. "They were not cruel people. They simply had a clear idea of what I was supposed to be, and I was not it. And the gap between what they expected and what I became over time, a kind of liability they felt they had the right to settle." Cole turned to look at her. Not the evaluating look, and not the provisional look, and not even the look from the rainy pasture. This was something anterior to all of those, something that had existed before Cole Maddox had learned to use his eyes as an instrument of assessment. It was simply a person looking at another person. "You are not defective," he said. He said it the way he said the beaver dam was blocked, or the south pasture soil was deep, as a statement of observable fact that he had no personal investment in being received well. Nell felt the words arrive. She noted their effect on her with the same precise attention she brought to everything, and she noted that the precision was in this instance inadequate to the task. "No," she said after a moment, "I am not." The sun went below the timber ridge, and the gold went out of the light, and the evening moved into the blue hour that preceded dark, and neither of them moved from the paddock fence for some time. When they finally did, they walked back toward the house and the bunkhouse in the same direction, without coordinating it, and they parted at the junction of the two paths without ceremony, and Nell went inside, and Cole went to the bunkhouse, and the night settled over the ranch with the ordinary, reliable thoroughness of nights in the territory. She lay awake for a while, not with anxiety, but with the heightened alert quality of someone whose internal landscape has shifted and who is taking new measurements. The house around her was quiet. Outside, the post-storm creek was running higher than usual and audible through the window she had cracked an inch against the lingering warmth. She listened to it and thought about what a person is when everything that was supposed to define them turns out to have been someone else's definition. She thought about 840 acres and a functioning well and the south pasture soil and the creek basin and the deeded grazing rights, all of which were hers. And she thought about a man in the bunkhouse 20 yards away who had planted his hands on her rope without being asked, and who said true things in the flat, undecorated voice of someone who had decided long ago that decoration was a form of dishonesty. She slept eventually, and the creek ran on outside the window, and the land held its livestock and its fences and its two complicated human inhabitants in the particular equitable darkness that makes no distinction between people. The fourth week brought the first real heat of deep summer, the kind of heat that arrives after July's false promise of rain and settles in for a stay, turning the ground back to iron and the air above the south pasture into something that shimmered and wavered like a second landscape laid over the first. The cattle moved slowly in it, congregating near the creek bank in the shade of the willows, and the work of the ranch reorganized itself around the heat's demands, starting earlier in the morning and stopping in the worst of the afternoon, and resuming at 5 when the air temperature conceded a degree or two. Cole built Nell a shade structure over the section of the south fence where she did most of her wire work, which he did one morning before she got there, without informing her of his intention or requesting acknowledgement afterward. It was 4 posts and a length of old canvas he had found in the outbuilding functional and not beautiful, and it made the work in the midday hours possible in a way it had not been before. She noted it in the morning when she arrived, and she looked at it, and she said nothing about it for the specific reason that saying something about it felt like it would reduce it to a smaller thing than it was. He brought her coffee in the field on the mornings she worked the north section, which was the farthest from the house. He did not deliver it with any particular grace, setting the tin cup on the fence post nearest her without interrupting her work, appearing and departing with the efficiency of a man who has decided to do a thing and has no interest in making a production of doing it. She began leaving his coffee on the bunkhouse step in the mornings when she was up first, which was most mornings because she woke early and could not make herself useful in a horizontal position. They did not discuss any of this. The accommodations accreted the way the days themselves accumulated gradually and without announcement, each one adding to a structure that neither of them had designed, but that both of them were apparently building. The trouble came on a Tuesday in the 5th week, from the direction she had least prepared for, which was the direction of the town. One of the 4 town bosses, a man named Garrett Hollis, who operated the largest mercantile in Harlan Crossing and who had the particular dangerous patience of a man who prefers to create problems through systems rather than direct confrontation, had apparently spent the previous weeks reviewing the circumstances of the Black Spur property sale with legal assistance. He sent a letter delivered by a sullen boy on a slow mule, claiming that the property sale had procedural irregularities that rendered the title potentially contestable, and that his client, meaning himself, intended to file a challenge in territorial court. Nell read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and got her notebook and her pen. Cole came in for the midday meal and found her at the table with papers spread around her in the organized geometry of someone who has been working a problem. He looked at the letter without touching it, and she told him what it said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Hollis has been trying to get that land for 2 years. He didn't bid because he was afraid of me. Now he's decided being afraid of me is less expensive than watching you build something on it." "He may have a case," Nell said carefully. "The starting bid was irregular. The territorial court has grounds to review." "Do you have records of the full process?" Cole asked. "Every document," Nell said. "I have the assessor's report, the seizure order, the auction notice, the registry of bidders, and my receipt." She paused. "What I do not have is a lawyer within 40 miles who is not also afraid of Hollis, or of you, or of both of you." Cole sat down. He picked up the letter and read it slowly and completely, and she could see him processing it the way he processed the fence line and the soil conditions and the creek basin, with the particular attention of a man who finds problems more interesting than their absence. "There is a woman in Crail County," he said. "She practices land law. She handled a title dispute for a rancher I knew 3 years ago, and she won it." He set the letter down. "She is not afraid of Hollis. She is not afraid of me. I am not certain she is afraid of anything." "You will contact her," Nell said. not a question. Cole looked at her. "If that is what you need." "Yes," Nell said. "It is." He rode to send the telegraph that afternoon, which meant riding to Harlan Crossing and through it, and she watched him go from the porch and thought about what it cost a man like Cole Maddox to ride back through the town that had watched him led away in chains, and she thought about the fact that he did it without stating the cost and without waiting to be asked twice. The lawyer, whose name was Francis Aldridge, arrived 4 days later in a buggy she drove herself. She was somewhere in her 50s, small and dark-haired, and brisk in the manner of a person for whom time is a non-renewable resource, and she shook Nell's hand with a grip that communicated both capability and an impatience to proceed. She reviewed Nell's documents in 3 hours at the kitchen table, asking sharp, specific questions and making her own notes in a hand so small it appeared to be a personal form of encryption. At the end of the 3 hours, she set down her pen and said, "Your title is sound. The procedural challenge is thin. Hollis knows it is thin, and he is hoping you do not." "I know," Nell said. "He is counting on the cost of a legal defense to persuade you to settle," Francis Aldridge said. "He will offer you a buyout, less than the land is worth. He will frame it as generosity." "He will be disappointed," Nell said. Francis Aldridge looked at her with a brief assessing attention that had something of Cole's quality in it, the evaluation of a person who has developed fast, accurate judgment from professional necessity. Whatever she concluded appeared to satisfy her. "I will file the response," she said. "Hollis's challenge will not survive the first review." She paused and looked at Cole, who had been present throughout the meeting in the particular mode he had developed for situations where his presence was relevant, but his participation was not, which was to occupy a chair in the corner of the room in a manner that somehow managed to be both physically obvious and conversationally invisible. "You will stay out of it," she said to him without heat. "If Hollis can make this about you rather than about the title, he improves his position." "Understood," Cole said. Francis Aldridge stayed the night in the spare room and left before sunrise, which Nell respected as the behavior of a person who was also excellent at the management of her own time. She sent a brief telegraph from Harlan Crossing 2 weeks later that said only, "Challenge dismissed, title confirmed." Nell read the message at the kitchen table and set it down, and sat quietly for a moment with her hands flat on the table, and then she went back to the ranch accounts because the accounts did not pause for legal victories. Cole was at the paddock fence in the late afternoon when she brought him the telegraph message. He read it and handed it back and said, "It won't be the last challenge." "No?" Nell agreed. "But I was not planning to leave after this one, and I am not planning to leave after the next one." He looked at her. The evening light was doing the same thing it had done on the night they talked about the stallion and their respective histories, which was to lay itself across everything with a generosity that the midday sun categorically refused. Cole Maddox in that light was a different problem than Cole Maddox in the flat white light of a working day. She was aware of this with the precise, unsettling attention of someone who has been aware of it for some time and has been declining for practical reasons to look directly at the awareness. She looked at it now. It was easier than she had expected and harder than she had prepared for, which was exactly the character of the things in her life that turned out to matter. "I was wrong about you," Cole said. He said it simply without elaboration in the voice that reserved decoration for things that needed it, and seemed to have determined this did not. Nell held the telegraph message in her bandaged hands, which were healing cleanly now, and she thought about all the things a person could be wrong about, all the particular costly errors of assessment that the human tendency toward category and prejudice made possible and inevitable. And she thought about standing at the back of an auction yard in a faded dress, being looked at by a man who needed something to look down upon and found her convenient. "I know," she said. "I know you were." The evening moved on around them. Behind the timber ridge, the sky was doing something complicated and beautiful with the remaining light, the kind of sky that a person stores up for the winter months when the territory turns gray and the beautiful things require memory to access. Cole was still looking at her. She was still looking back. The paddock fence between them was just a fence, a thing they had both put their hands on when it needed to hold, and it had held. She turned and walked back to the house, and the screen door shut behind her with the soft sound of a thing that has been hung correctly on its hinges, and inside the kitchen the cook stove was warm, and the accounts book was on the table, and outside the window the last of the light was going, and Eleanor Whitmore stood in the middle of the home she had built from blood money and silence and the stubborn, indestructible fact of her own refusal to be what other people had decided she was. And she felt for the first time in a long and careful life that the word home was not a complicated word at all. It was simply the place where the rope held. The letter from Francis Aldridge arrived on a Wednesday, and by Thursday the news had spread through Harlan Crossing, the way news always spread through small towns, which was faster than logic should have allowed, and with a degree of embellishment that bore a loose but recognizable relationship to the original facts. The title challenge had failed. The Black Spur Ranch belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, under clean, confirmed territorial deed, and no amount of Garrett Hollis's careful legal maneuvering had been sufficient to change that. Nell heard about the town's reaction from Mrs. Halsey, who continued to be her most reliable source of information about Harlan Crossing's internal weather. Not because Nell cultivated the relationship for intelligence purposes, but because Mrs. Halsey was constitutionally incapable of being in the presence of another person without reporting everything she knew. The town was divided apparently in the way that small towns divide over things that unsettle the existing order without being clearly wrong. Half of Harlan Crossing had decided Nell was admirable. The other half had decided she was dangerous. Both halves were paying considerably more attention to the Black Spur Ranch than they had been 6 weeks ago, which Nell noted as a development with implications in both directions. What Mrs. Halsey could not tell her, because Mrs. Halsey did not know it was what was being said in the particular conversations that happened in the back rooms of saloons and in the quiet hours before dawn along the territorial roads that connected Harlan Crossing to the wider, less law-abiding world beyond it. Nell did not know this either. She was occupied with the accounts and the cattle and the south pasture and the well casing and the dozen other immediate and practical demands of a working ranch in the deep heat of summer, and the information that would have altered her assessment of her security was traveling toward her along roads she had not thought to watch. Cole knew before she did. She would understand this later, reconstructing the sequence with the careful precision she applied to everything. He had been in Harlan Crossing on an errand for ranch supplies when he heard something in a conversation not meant for him, the specific kind of fragment that a man with Cole's history recognizes and catalogs without appearing to. He came back from town that afternoon with the supplies and an expression that had returned to the closed, hard configuration of his early weeks on the ranch, the face of a man reassembling the walls he had allowed to come partway down. Nell was at the kitchen table with the accounts when he came in, and she looked up and read the expression the way she had learned to read it, not its surface but its structure, the difference between Cole's ordinary remoteness and the particular quality of alertness underneath the remoteness that meant something had changed. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put the supplies on the counter first, setting each item down with a controlled precision that she recognized as the physical manifestation of a man managing something internal that he has not yet decided how to deliver. Then he sat across from her at the table in the chair that had become his chair without either of them designating it as such, and he looked at his hands for a moment. "Decker Vane knows about the ranch," he said. Nell set down her pen. Decker Vane was a name she had encountered once in the territorial records she had read in her weeks of research before the auction. He appeared in 2 separate warrant documents as a co-conspirator in operations that overlapped with Cole's, and the language the federal marshal used to describe him in those documents was the careful, precise language of a law officer who wants the record to reflect that he understands exactly what he is dealing with. Cole had never mentioned him. "He runs your old outfit," Nell said. It was not a question. "He runs what is left of it," Cole said. After the federal warrants, the operation scattered. Vane pulled together what remained. 8, maybe 10 men. He paused. He has been watching the ranch since the title challenge. He knows Hollis failed. He knows you are a woman alone on 800 acres with no ranch hands and a single hired man whose legal situation prevents him from carrying a firearm. The ankle monitor, the condition of Cole's release. A man on release conditions could not be armed, which was a technicality that the law considered sufficient, and which Vane apparently had considered and found useful. "What does he want?" Nell asked. "The cattle, the house, the land, if he can hold it long enough to sell the timber rights." Cole said this with the flat informational clarity of someone reading from a document which she understood was how he managed to say it at all. "He will come at night. He will burn the outbuildings first to pull us out of the house. Standard approach." "When?" Nell asked. "I don't know. Soon. He moves when the opportunity presents itself, and the opportunity is presenting itself now." He looked up at her. "I want you to go to Harlan Crossing. Stay with Mrs. Halsey. I will send for the marshal." Nell looked at him across the table. She looked at him for a long moment with the full, steady attention she brought to things that required her complete honesty. "No," she said. Cole's jaw tightened. "Nell." "No," she said again in the same clear, level voice. "I will not leave this land." "Vane has 10 armed men," Cole said. "I cannot carry a weapon. The marshal is 2 hours from here on a good road, and Vane knows it and has planned around it." "Then we plan around what we have," Nell said. She pulled her notebook toward her and opened it to a fresh page and picked up her pen. "Tell me everything you know about how Vane operates, where he comes from, how he approaches, what order he does things in. Tell me what he considers a contained threat versus an escalating one. Tell me what makes him stop versus what makes him commit." Cole looked at her, and the look had the quality of a man standing at the edge of something and taking a precise measurement of the distance to the bottom. "If I tell you that," he said slowly, "you're going to make a plan that requires you to be on that porch with a rifle." "Yes," Nell said, "that is not a plan. That is a way to get yourself killed." "It is a plan that requires you to trust me to hold my position the way I held the fence," she said, "and it requires me to trust that you will do what needs to be done on your end." The silence between them was not the early silence of opposition or the later silence of provisional truce. It was the silence of two people standing inside a decision that has already been made by something larger than either of them and is simply waiting for the words to catch up. "I have been in worse positions than this," Cole said. "So have I," Nell said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he reached across the table and turned the notebook toward himself, and he began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. He told her everything he knew about Vane's operational habits. The approach routes, the staging patterns, the sequence of actions that Vane used because it had worked before, and men like Vane did not innovate when repetition was sufficient. He told her about the men, their individual tendencies and capabilities, which of them were disciplined and which of them were not, which of them would stop if the situation became sufficiently complicated, and which of them would not stop regardless. He told her all of this with the precise, unsparing thoroughness of a man who has decided that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing completely, and Nell took notes in her small, clear hand and asked precise questions and filled 4 pages in her notebook. When he finished, she looked at what she had written and she made a separate list. What they had, what they needed, what could be improvised from one to address the other. What they had was the Winchester rifle that had come with the house property. A Colt revolver she kept in the kitchen drawer, which Cole knew about and had said nothing about, which she took as tacit acknowledgment that she was not the kind of person who needed to be advised to keep a firearm. 300 feet of fence wire in the outbuilding. 2 oil lanterns, the cook stove, and the particular detailed knowledge of the property that came from walking every foot of it in the early mornings and late evenings of the past 5 weeks. What Cole had was his mind and his hands, and the exact tactical knowledge of the people who were coming and no legal right to carry a weapon on his person. "The wire?" Nell said. Cole looked at the list. He looked at it for a long moment. "The approach road," he said, "from the east draw." "Yes," she said, "and the paddock gate. They will want the horses." "Vane will send 2 men to the outbuilding first," Cole said. "He always sends 2 first to test the response. If the response is immediate and organized, he reassesses. If the response is slow or absent, he commits the full force." "Then the response needs to be immediate," Nell said. "The response needs to be something he has not seen before," Cole said. He was looking at the 4th page of her notes where she had drawn a rough diagram of the property from memory, the house and bunkhouse and outbuildings, and the paddock and the road and the 2 draws on the eastern and western edges of the approach. His finger moved across the diagram, and she watched his tactical mind engage with the problem the way she had watched him engage with the damaged fence line and the blocked irrigation channel with the focused, unsentimental attention of someone for whom problems are primarily engineering. They planned for 3 more hours. By the end of it, Nell's notebook had 6 pages of notes and 2 revised diagrams and a sequence of actions mapped to a sequence of anticipated events, the kind of contingent planning that she had always been good at, and that Cole, it turned out, was extraordinary at, because contingent planning in his previous life had been the difference between freedom and a federal cell, and his mind had developed the capacity accordingly. He went to the bunkhouse at 10 o'clock. She sat alone at the kitchen table with the lamp and her notes and the Colt revolver she had placed on the table beside the notebook, and she looked at the plan they had made together and looked for its weaknesses with the same rigorous honesty she brought to the ranch accounts. The honesty that did not permit the comfort of assuming a figure was correct simply because she wanted it to be. The plan had weaknesses. Every plan had weaknesses. The relevant question was never whether a plan was perfect, but whether its strengths were sufficient to its purpose, and she believed these were with one condition. The condition was that she could hold her position on the porch with the rifle and maintain her cover fire without flinching through whatever Vane's men directed at the house, long enough for Cole to do what needed to be done with the fence wire and the approach road and the particular tactical knowledge that was the only weapon his release conditions had not taken from him. She thought about the fence post in the storm. She thought about her bloody hands on the rope and the mud in her face, and the 2 seconds she had spent in the cold ground before she got up. She thought about what it had taken to get up and what she had found when she did. She believed she could hold the position. She put the revolver back in the kitchen drawer and went to bed and slept, which was the decision of a person who has made her plan and understands that anxiety is an expense with no return. They came on a Friday 3 days later. They came at 2 in the morning, which was when Cole had said they would come because Vane preferred the deepest part of the night when human alertness is at its lowest and the darkness is its most complete. Cole had been awake for an hour already. Nell had been awake for 2, which she had not mentioned to him. She heard the horses before he signaled her 3 short whistles from the direction of the paddock, which was what they had agreed on, and she was already at the window of the main house looking east when the first movement appeared at the edge of the draw. 2 men, exactly as Cole had predicted, moving on foot horses left somewhere back along the approach road because Vane's people knew that the sound of horses' carries and boots on dry ground are quieter. They moved toward the nearest outbuilding with the practiced, careful movement of men who have done this before and have a settled confidence in their own competence. What they had not done before was walk into 300 feet of fence wire strung at shin height across the approach in the darkness between the draw and the outbuilding. The sound was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of men going down hard, and unexpectedly, the specific percussion of bodies meeting ground at speed, and it was followed by a silence that had the character of shock, the silence of people recalibrating very quickly to a situation that has departed from the expected. Then one of them said something sharp, and they began to untangle themselves from the wire, and Nell opened the front door of the main house and stepped onto the porch and cocked the Winchester. "Stop where you are," she said. Her voice carried in the night air with the same flat, clear quality she used at the kitchen table and in the land office, and in every situation that required her to be heard precisely once. The two men stopped. From the direction of the main gate where Decker Vane would be watching the approach with the rest of his men, waiting for the signal that the outbuilding was secured, there was a pause. Nell counted the pause. She had discussed with Cole the exact length of time Vane would take to assess an unexpected response before he made his next decision, and Cole had said 7 to 10 seconds because Vane was a careful man who did not act on incomplete information. At 8 seconds, the sound of horses came from the gate. Multiple horses, the full force committing. "Now," Nell said to the darkness to her left, where Cole was not because Cole was elsewhere, which was the point. The first rider through the gate hit the second wire line at chest height, and the horse went sideways, and the rider went over, and the sound of it was significant. The second rider pulled up hard enough that his horse went to its haunches, and then from the western draw came the sound of an oil lantern being thrown into the dry brush Cole had arranged there over the previous 3 days, a deliberate accumulation of the driest material the property offered, placed with the specific intention of creating a wall of fire between the western draw and the gate approach that was spectacular to observe, and not actually dangerous to any structure, because Cole had chosen the location with the same precise, unsentimental care he brought to everything. The fire went up fast and high and orange, and in its light, the situation at the gate became entirely visible, which was the point. Vane's men at the gate could see each other, and they could see the fire, and they could see the two men on the ground near the outbuilding untangling themselves from wire. And what they could not see was Cole, because Cole was in the shadow of the bunkhouse with a length of fence post that was not a firearm, and that his release conditions said nothing whatsoever about. He came out of the shadow with the efficiency of a man who has calculated the distance and the sequence and the available time, and has reduced it to a purely mechanical problem. And the first man he reached did not have the opportunity to register his arrival before the situation was resolved. The second man turned in time to understand what was happening and not in time to do anything useful about it. Cole moved through the gap between the two downed riders with the focused economic force of a man who is not performing competence, but simply exercising it, and the sounds from the gate were the sounds of a situation collapsing. Decker Vane was not at the gate. Nell had known he would not be. Vane was a man who organized things. Cole had told her, not a man who executed them personally, unless there was no alternative, and he would have positioned himself at the top of the east draw with a clear view of the property and an equally clear path of retreat. Which was why when the fire went up and the gate situation resolved itself into something Vane had absolutely not planned for, and the figure on the porch of the main house was a woman with a Winchester rifle who had not flinched at any of it. Decker Vane looked down from the east draw at the remains of his raid, and made the calculation that a surviving man makes when the variables have departed too far from the plan. He took the path of retreat. Nell heard the sound of a single horse moving fast up the east draw, and she watched the darkness in that direction until the sound was gone. And then she lowered the Winchester and stood on the porch in the firelight and took stock. 4 men down at and near the gate alive and considerably more compliant than they had arrived. 2 men in the yard near the outbuilding untangled from the wire and seated on the ground with the expressions of people who have had a very educational evening. Cole standing in the yard with the fence post held loosely at his side, breathing steadily, looking at the gate. The fire in the western draw burned itself out against the fire break Cole had prepared on the property side, a strip of cleared earth that had appeared to be simple yard maintenance and was in fact the most important element of the entire plan. The brush fire made its statement and expired without reaching anything that mattered. Nell walked down the porch steps and across the yard. She walked past the downed men at the gate, and she walked to where Cole was standing, and she stood beside him, and they looked together at what the night had produced. "Vane ran," she said. "Yes," Cole said. "He will not come back," she said. It was not entirely a question. Cole considered this for a moment with the honest precision that characterized his assessments. "He will not come back to this property," he said. "A man like Vane operates on the principle that the next target is easier than the last one. He has other options." "Then we should make sure the marshal knows which direction he went," Nell said. "Yes," Cole said. She looked at the men on the ground. 6 men, in total various states of dishevelment, none of them in possession of any particular dignity. She looked at them with the same neutral, assessing attention she had brought to the auction yard and the land office, and every other situation that had required her to see clearly what was actually there, rather than what she had expected. "Good evening," she said to them in the same clear voice she used for all transactions. "The marshal will be here within 2 hours. I would recommend against making any decisions that would complicate your situation further." None of them said anything. One of them nodded, which she took as a reasonable response given the circumstances. She and Cole sent the telegraph from the ranch, which required writing to the junction box at the property boundary, and using the line Cole had quietly arranged access to 3 days earlier because Nell believed in having communication options that did not require a 6-mile ride to town. The marshal arrived in just under 2 hours, which was as fast as the road allowed, with 2 deputies who managed the 6 men with professional efficiency and took down Nell's account and Cole's account and left before dawn with a chain of prisoners and a description of Decker Vane's direction of travel. The marshal, a tall, methodical man named Briggs, who had the quality of someone who had seen most things and had developed a settled, unsurprisable relationship with human behavior, looked at the fence wire strung across the approach and the remains of the controlled brush fire in the western draw and the general condition of the gate area, and then he looked at Nell. "This was planned, too," he said, not accusingly, observationally. "Yes," Nell said. He looked at Cole. He looked at the fence post, which Cole had set down against the paddock fence in the way of a man returning a tool to its proper place. He looked back at Nell. "Smart," Briggs said, and made a note in his book and went about his business. In the quiet after the marshal left the ranch, settled back into the particular silence of a place that has been through something and is now simply present in the aftermath. The fire in the western draw was a line of dark ash against the lightening sky. The eastern horizon was doing the slow, incremental work of becoming morning, the sky moving through the stages of its daily reconstruction, from black to deep blue to the thin, watery gold that arrived just before the sun. Cole was at the paddock fence. Nell found him there when she came back from checking the outbuildings, which were undamaged, which was the outcome of a plan that had worked. He was leaning on the top rail with his arms crossed and his face toward the east, and the morning light was arriving on his face in the slow, certain way that morning light arrives on everything without preference and without mercy. She stood beside him. The space between them at the fence rail was the same space they had occupied on the evening he had told her about the stallion and his brother, and the space had the character of something known now, something that had been measured and found reliable. "It is over," she said. "For now," Cole said. "That is all over ever means," she said. He looked at her. The morning light was fully on both of them, now the early gold of it that made everything look slightly more than it was, or perhaps accurately what it was, because she had come to believe that the dawn light did not flatter so much as it clarified, burning away the complications of shadow and leaving the actual shape of things. Cole's face in that light was the face of a man who has arrived somewhere. He did not plan to arrive. and has been standing in the new place long enough that the initial disorientation has given way to something more settled. He looked at her with the full direct attention that had begun as assessment, and had become over the weeks of this shared improbable life something that had no tactical component in it at all. "I owe you something," he said. "You owe me nothing," Nell said. "We had a contract." "Not the contract," Cole said. He turned from the fence to face her directly. Cole Maddox facing a person directly was an event with a specific gravity to it, the focused entirety of a person who withholds most of himself most of the time, and is in this moment withholding none of it. "I owe you the truth that I was wrong about what I thought this was." Nell held his gaze. "What did you think it was?" she asked. "My land being held by someone temporary," he said. "A situation to be reversed. A woman who would fail and prove me right about what I thought I knew." He paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was the pause of a man being careful with words because the words matter, and he knows it. "You are not temporary. This is not a situation to be reversed. And I was not right about anything I thought I knew when I looked at you in that auction yard." The morning settled around them. The cattle in the south pasture were beginning their day with the unhurried, purposeful movement of animals who know what the morning requires of them. The creek was running in the creek basin, the same sound it had always made reliable and continuous, the sound of the land doing what it had always done, regardless of who stood on it or what they said to each other. "I am not asking you for anything," Cole said. "I am not making a claim. You own this land and everything on it, and I work here by contract, and that is the truth of our situation, and I am not confused about it." "Cole," Nell said, "I am telling you because you deserve honesty from me," he said. "Whatever else I have been to you and whatever else I will be, you deserve that at minimum." "Cole," she said again, and something in the way she said his name, the weight she placed on the two syllables of it, made him stop. She had thought over the weeks of their difficult, incremental, entirely unplanned proximity that she knew what she felt about him. She had categorized it with the precision she brought to categories noted. It assessed its implications and filed it under the heading of things that were true and present and not immediately actionable. She had done this because she was Eleanor Whitmore, and because the management of inconvenient truths was one of the most practiced skills she possessed. She looked at him in the morning light, and the category system was inadequate, and she knew it. "I am not confused about our situation either," she said. "I am clear about what I own and what I have built and what I intend to keep building. I am equally clear about the fact that none of those things are diminished by the presence of a person who put his hands on the rope when I was in the mud." She held his gaze with the steadiness that had held fence lines and outlaws and the public contempt of a town and her own long history of being told she was not enough. "You are not an employee I am managing," she said. "You have not been that for some time. I suspect we both know this." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "I know it," he said, quietly in the voice that did not perform itself. The morning came on around them, and the land held them both on it. And Nell reached up and placed her bandaged hand against the side of his face in the straightforward, unhesitating way she did all things that she had decided were worth doing. And he put his hand over hers and held it there, and the morning light on the Black Spur Ranch was the same morning light it had always been falling on the same 840 acres, and none of it was the same at all. The morning after Decker Vane's men were taken away in chains, Harlan Crossing knew about it before noon. This was not surprising. The marshal's office generated paperwork, and paperwork generated conversation, and conversation in a small territory town generated the particular accelerated mythology that attaches itself to events that confirm or challenge the existing arrangement of things. 6 men arrested in a failed raid on the Black Spur Ranch. The woman who owned it, standing on the porch with a Winchester. Cole Maddox in the yard with a fence post. No shots fired from the defending side, which was the detail that seemed to produce the most prolonged bewilderment in the people who heard it. Nell knew the story was moving through town because Mrs. Halsey sent a note delivered by the same sullen boy on the same slow mule that consisted of 4 sentences. The note said that people were talking, that the talking was on balance favorable, that Garrett Hollis had been observed leaving his mercantile that morning with the expression of a man who has bet on the wrong outcome and is working out the cost, and that Mrs. Halsey herself thought Nell should know that the man who ran the feed and grain on the south end of Harlan Crossing had asked, apparently without irony, whether the Black Spur Ranch might be hiring. Nell read the note at the kitchen table and set it down, and looked at Cole, who was at the stove pouring coffee with the unhurried movement of a man who has slept adequately and is at peace with the morning. "The feed and grain man wants to know if we are hiring," she said. Cole turned from the stove. His expression had the quality it had developed over the past weeks, the particular configuration of a face that has stopped managing itself against the possibility of warmth and has made a different kind of peace with its own interior. He looked at her across the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and said, "Are we?" The word we arrived in the space between them without drama, a single syllable that had the weight of everything that had accumulated since a contract signed by a fire on the side of a road, and Nell felt it land with the same precise attention she brought to everything that mattered. "I think we might be," she said. The hiring of ranch hands turned out to be, like most things on the Black Spur Ranch, a practical matter that resolved itself through the application of clear terms and consistent follow-through. The feed and grain man, whose name was Pete Aldous, was the first. He arrived on a Monday morning on a reliable bay horse with his gear packed neatly and his hat in his hands, and Nell interviewed him at the kitchen table with the same directness she brought to all her transactions. He knew cattle, and he knew fencing, and he knew the territory, and he was not afraid of Cole Maddox, which was the quality she had listed first in the private assessment she had made before his arrival. He was not afraid of Cole because he had grown up 2 valleys over and had known of Cole's reputation for years, but had also, in the specific way that territory people know each other across distance, known that Cole Maddox ran the Black Spur operation cleanly and paid what he owed and kept his word to the people he worked with, whatever else he had done in the wider world. This information, which had been available in Harlan Crossing all along, but had been obscured by the louder and more dramatic narrative of the outlaw, and his chains had apparently reasserted itself in the wake of Friday night's events. A man who stood in a yard with a fence post between 10 armed raiders and 1 woman on a porch was a man whose word about working conditions was probably reliable. 2 more men came by the end of the following week. Then a 4th, a quiet, capable man named Rollins, who had experience with the kind of cattle management the South Pasture's capacity could support. Nell interviewed each of them herself and hired 3 of the 4, declining the 4th, not because she doubted his ability, but because she had looked at him for 40 minutes and concluded that he was afraid of something he was not disclosing, and a ranch that had already had 1 person in its employ operating on a hidden agenda had filled its quota for that experience. Cole watched the hiring process with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite approval, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He did not involve himself in the interviews because she had not asked him to, and because he appeared to understand with the pragmatic clarity that characterized his better moments that the operation of the ranch was hers to conduct, and his role in it was to be the best version of what he actually was, which was the most knowledgeable person within 40 miles about the specific challenges and opportunities of this specific land. He showed the new hands the property with the thorough, unsentimental authority of someone who knows every foot of it, which he did. And Nell watched him do this from the paddock fence one morning and thought about the first day she had sat at the kitchen table and told him what needed doing, and he had answered with the reluctant accuracy of a man providing information to the enemy. The distance between that version of Cole Maddox and the version standing in the south pasture, patiently explaining the drainage pattern of the lower field to Pete Aldous, was not a short distance. She had some sense of what it had cost to cover it, and she did not make the mistake of considering it a small thing. The ankle monitor came off on a Thursday in August. The marshal's office sent a deputy to remove it, a young man who arrived at the ranch with a key and a form, and the slightly self-conscious air of someone performing an administrative task in circumstances that felt more significant than the administration required. Cole sat on the bunkhouse step while the deputy worked the lock, and Nell stood at a sufficient distance to give the moment its privacy while remaining close enough to be present for it, which she had decided was the right geometry. The iron cuff came off, and the deputy collected it and had Cole sign the release form and rode away, and Cole sat on the bunkhouse step for a long moment looking at his ankle, at the ring of pale chafed skin where the cuff had been, at the absence of the weight he had been carrying for months. Nell walked over and sat down on the step beside him. He did not say anything for a long time. She did not fill the silence with words it did not need. "The federal conditions are discharged," he said finally. "Fully. The warrant is closed." He paused. "I am a free man on open land." "Yes," Nell said. He looked at the pasture and the cattle in it, and the fence line they had built together, and the tree line at the south end, and the sky above all of it, the August sky that was the particular saturated blue of the territory at its best, and most itself. And the expression on his face was not simple enough to be called happiness, because Cole Maddox was not a simple enough person for his emotions to resolve into single notes. It was the expression of a man standing in a fact so large that its full dimensions were still being discovered. "I need to go to Harlan Crossing," he said. She looked at him. "There are things I need to do there," he said. "Accounts I have not settled, not financial accounts." He paused. The kind that a man carries when he has been operating outside the law and has told himself the ledger is balanced because no one has formally presented it. She understood what he meant. She had known in the careful way she knew things about him that this reckoning was coming, that it was part of the architecture of the person Cole Maddox was becoming and could not be bypassed without the structure being unsound. "Do you want company?" she asked. He looked at her sideways with the brief involuntary quality of a look that arrives before the decision to look is made. "You have a ranch to run," he said. "The ranch has 4 hands and a foreman," she said. "Pete Aldous knows what needs doing today. I'm asking whether you want company." The quiet held for a moment. "Yes," he said. Not elaborated, not decorated, just the word in the voice that meant it. They rode to Harlan Crossing together on a Friday morning Cole on the gray gelding, because Nell had insisted he use the better horse and had taken the rented bay that Rawlins had brought with him, and the road between the ranch and town moved past them with the particular unhurried quality of territory roads in the early morning before the heat has made its daily commitment. Harlan Crossing received them differently than it had received either of them alone. Nell had ridden through it multiple times now, and the town had moved through its cycle of watching her from the suspension of judgment to something approaching ordinary acceptance, the way towns always move when the unusual becomes through repetition, simply the actual. But Cole had not ridden freely through Harlan Crossing since before the warrant, and the town felt this and made its adjustments. Men who would have stepped back from him 6 months ago nodded from the boardwalk. The woman who ran the dry goods opened her door and said good morning. As they passed directly and without the performative quality of someone managing fear. Purvis, the auctioneer moving supplies from his wagon to his storefront, stopped and looked at Cole for a long moment, and then lifted his hand, and Cole returned the gesture with a nod that was brief and complete. There were also people who looked away. There were people who found reasons to be inside when Cole's horse was at the hitching post. Nell noted these as well without judgment, because she understood that the ledger of a man's past is not wiped clean by a single night's events, however definitive, and that Cole Maddox understood this better than she did, and had not asked the world to pretend otherwise. He spent 2 hours in Harlan Crossing doing the things he had said he needed to do. Some of them she was present for, and some of them she was not. She was present when he went to the family of a man who had worked for his operation years ago and who had been injured in circumstances that Cole had always known were his responsibility and had never formally acknowledged. She sat in the small parlor of that family's house and watched Cole Maddox, who had never in her presence asked anything of anyone, sit across from a woman and her 2 grown sons and speak with the flat, unflinching honesty that was the only register he possessed, and say that he owed them what he should have paid years ago, and place an envelope on the table between them, and not mitigate it with explanation or soften it with appeals to circumstance. The woman looked at the envelope. She looked at Cole. She did not say thank you, and she did not say it was all right, because it had not been all right, and Cole had not asked her to say it was. She said, "I wondered if you would come," and Cole said, "It took me longer than it should have," and that was the end of it, complete and honest and sufficient. Nell walked with him back to the horses after, and they rode out of Harlan Crossing side by side in the late morning with the sun beginning its serious work above the valley, and neither of them spoke for a while because the morning had contained things that were not comfortable and had been done anyway. And that kind of thing sometimes requires the silence of the road afterward to settle into its proper place. "Was there more?" she asked when they were clear of the town. "One more," he said. "Not in Harlan Crossing." She waited. "My brother is in Crail County," he said. "He has been there since the warrant. He has a family." He looked at the road ahead, the long, straight road between the territory grass and the sky. "I do not intend to forgive him. I want to be clear about that. I have thought about it with the same honesty I try to bring to everything, and the answer is that forgiveness is not the right word for what I have available to offer." "What is the right word?" Nell asked. Cole considered. "Release," he said slowly. "The thing you do when you put down a weight, not because it has stopped being heavy, but because carrying it is using something you need for other things." He paused. "I have other things now." She looked at him on the horse beside her, the man who had called out her body in a public yard to preserve his pride, and who had signed a contract to avoid freezing, and who had stepped into mud and rain without being asked, and who had stood between her and 10 armed men with a fence post, and who had sat in a stranger's parlor with an envelope, and said the true thing without asking to be thanked for it. She looked at the full, complicated truth of him in the morning light. "I will ride to Crail County with you," she said, "when you are ready." "I know," he said, and the way he said it, the simple, settled certainty of it, told her that he had known before she offered, and that this was one of the things he had meant when he stood at the paddock fence in the dawn and told her he was not confused about what they were to each other. The autumn came to the valley with the gradual, deliberate quality of seasons in the territory. The mornings cooling first, and then the evenings, and finally the middays, the grasses going from summer gold to the deeper, rougher ochre of the fall. The timber ridge to the west turning through its brief, serious colors before the leaves came down and left the ridge bones visible against the sky. The cattle put on weight in the good fall grass, and Pete Aldous proved himself in the south pasture with a competence that justified the interview, and the ranch moved into the season with the settled productivity of a place that has found its working rhythm and intends to keep it. Nell expanded the accounts in September. She had been in correspondence with a cattle buyer in the next territory since August letters composed at the kitchen table in the evening after supper, precise and businesslike, laying out the herd's quality and size, and the ranch's grazing capacity, and the terms she was prepared to offer. The buyer came in October, a trim, efficient man who wore his good suit as a working tool rather than an ornament, and he walked the south pasture with Cole and looked at the cattle with the appraising eye of someone whose livelihood depended on accurate assessment. And when he came back to the kitchen table to negotiate, he found Nell waiting for him with her notebook and her pen, and the particular patient steadiness of a woman who has done this before in the only sense that matters, which is the sense of knowing her own value and being unwilling to settle for less. She got the price she had calculated. Not the first number she named, because no first number in a negotiation is the final number, but the number she had determined before the buyer arrived was the accurate price of what she was selling, arrived at by the third exchange of figures. The buyer shook her hand with the genuine respect of a man who has just discovered he was not going to get the discount he had planned on and left with a contract that suited both parties. Cole, who had been present at the table through the negotiation in his preferred capacity of occupying space without inserting himself, watched the buyer ride down the cottonwood track and said, "You knew he would come up to that number." "I knew the herd was worth it," Nell said. "The numbers tell you what a thing is worth if you are willing to listen to them." He looked at her. "You have always known what things are worth," he said. She looked up from the contract she was reviewing. The remark had the quality of his more important remarks, the ones that appeared to be about one thing and were about something else, or were accurately about both things at once. "Most things," she said. "I have been wrong about some." "What things?" he asked. She set the contract down. "I thought for a long time that without money I had no value," she said. "That the leather pouch against my ribs was the reason I was allowed to take up space in the world." She looked at the contract, the numbers on it that represented her work and her land and her decisions. "The money is real, the value of it is real, but it is not the source of the other thing. I know that now." Cole was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had arrived that he was taking seriously. "What is the source of the other thing?" he asked. Nell considered the question with the honest attention it deserved. "The rope," she said finally. "The willingness to hold it even when the ground gives out underneath you." Cole nodded once the way he acknowledged things that were accurate and did not require elaboration. They rode to Crail County on a Saturday in late October, when the ranch was stable enough for Pete Aldous to manage the weekend's requirements, and the road to the next territory was still clear before the winter weather made it something more serious. It was a 4-hour ride, and they made it mostly in the comfortable, companionable quiet that had become the natural register of their time together, punctuated by conversation when one of them had something that wanted saying. Cole's brother lived on the edge of Crail County's main town in a small house that had the look of a place being maintained with effort and intention, if not quite with abundance. His name was Warren, and he was younger than Cole by 6 years, and smaller by several inches, and had, when he opened the door to find his brother standing on the step with a woman beside him, the expression of a man who has spent 2 years waiting for a consequence and has not stopped being afraid of it. Nell stayed on the porch. This was not what Cole had asked for, because Cole had not specified what he needed from her presence beyond the presence itself, but she read the geometry of the situation and made the call that the threshold of that house was where her company ended and Cole's private reckoning began. She stood on the porch in the late October air and listened to the sounds of the territory around the small house, the wind in the grass, and the distant sound of Crail County going about its Saturday, and the muffled, indistinct sound of 2 brothers in a small front room finding their way through a conversation that had no template and no certain destination. She was there for 40 minutes. She did not try to hear the words. She did not need to. When Cole came back through the door, his face had the quality of something that has been through a process and has come out the other side with the process visible in it, not broken and not healed, but honestly changed, which is the only kind of change that lasts. He stood on the porch beside her and looked at the Crail County sky and did not speak for a moment. "All right?" she asked. "Not all right," he said. "Better." He paused. "He has 2 daughters. They came in at the end. They look like him." Something moved across his face that was not a smile and was not grief and was perhaps the place where those 2 things live when they cannot be separated. "They look like our mother." Nell stood beside him in the October wind and did not say anything because the moment did not ask for words. It asked for the same thing the fence had asked for, and the mud had asked for, and every significant moment of the past months had asked for, which was simply the willingness to be present without conditions. They rode home in the afternoon, the 4 hours back along the Territory Road, with the low autumn sun at their backs and the shadow of 2 riders and 2 horses moving long and thin across the grass ahead of them. The sky was doing something remarkable to the west, the late light constructing the kind of sunset that the Territory specialized in, lavish and unapologetic. The colors stacked from the horizon up through orange to red to a deep saturated purple that faded at its upper edge into the first blue of evening. They were an hour from the ranch when Cole pulled the gray gelding up without warning. Nell pulled up beside him and looked at him, and he was looking at the sunset, and his face in its light was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. The walls not down, but absent, simply not there, as though the day had finally used up the energy required to maintain them, and he had made his peace with their absence. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. The sunset behind her threw a warm, complicated light across everything, and Cole Maddox looked at Eleanor Whitmore on her horse, in that light, with the full open attention of a man who has stopped measuring the risk of being seen. "I am not going to go back to what I was," he said. "I want you to know that not as a promise, because I understand what promises cost, and I do not spend them on things I am not certain of. I want you to know it as a fact that I have examined from every direction and found to be true. The man who said what he said in that auction yard is not the man I intend to be for whatever time I have on this land." Nell held his gaze in the last of the sunset. "I know," she said. "I have known it for some time." "How?" he asked. "The rope," she said simply. "A man who intends to remain what he was does not put his hands on the rope." He was quiet for a moment. The horses stood in the grass, and the sunset moved through its final stages, the colors deepening and then gentling, and then beginning at the horizon's edge to dissolve into the early dark. "I love you," Cole said. He said it the way he said all the things that mattered to him without performance. Without the elaborate staging that the phrase usually receives in the flat, true voice of a man reporting an observable fact about the world. "I am saying it once clearly, so there is no ambiguity in the record. You can do with it whatever you determine is right." Eleanor Whitmore had been told many things about herself in the course of her life. She had been told she was defective, and she had been told she was a liability, and she had been told in a public yard in front of 200 people what she was not permitted to ride. She had been told in the careful silence of her own long accumulation that she was worth only what she could prove in a ledger. She had never been told this, not in this voice, not with this quality of plain, undecorated truth. She felt it arrive in the place it was meant for, below the level of analysis, below the careful protective machinery of her mind, in the part of her that had held the rope when the ground gave out and had gotten up from the mud and had stood on the porch with a Winchester and had placed her bandaged hand against the face of a man who told the truth at a cost to himself without being asked to. "Cole," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said, with the same plainness, with the same honest, undecorated weight. "I am not saying it back as a courtesy. I am saying it because it is true, and because the accurate recording of true things is something I have always believed in." The corner of his mouth moved, and this time the almost smile completed itself. It was not a large smile. On Cole Maddox's face, a smile was a careful, considered thing, not given casually, all the more significant for its rarity. It lasted a moment and then settled back into the strong, familiar lines of his face, but it left something behind it, the way a tide leaves the shape of the wave in the sand after the water has gone back. He reached across the distance between the two horses and took her hand briefly, the way he had taken her hand at the kitchen table when her cuts needed cleaning, with the careful, purposeful gentleness of a man who is not performing tenderness but exercising it. Then he released it, and they turned the horses toward home and rode the last hour in the dark that had come on, while they were stopped the stars above them and the ranch lights visible eventually at the end of the road. 2 warm squares of window light against the deep black of the territory night. The morning he brought her the stallion was a Saturday in November. The first frost had come and gone, leaving the valley in the particular clarified state of early winter, the air sharp and the light thin and brilliant, the kind of morning where everything is exactly and only what it is stripped of summer's generosity and autumn's sentiment, simply itself in the clean cold. Nell was on the porch with her coffee and her notebook doing the winter accounts when she heard him come around the corner of the house. She heard the horse, too. The particular weighted rhythm of the black stallion's movement, which she recognized because she had heard it the one time at the auction and had apparently stored the sound in the part of her that stored things she was not ready to look at directly. She looked up. Cole was leading the stallion by a rope halter, walking beside the animal with the ease of a man who has renegotiated his relationship with this horse over whatever time and whatever patient, persistent work it had taken, and the horse was moving with him with the quality Nell had seen once before, that coiled, particular power moving in cooperation rather than containment. Cole stopped at the porch steps. The stallion stood beside him, its breath visible in the cold air, its black coat catching the winter light in the way that extraordinary things catch light, with a completeness that leaves nothing unreflected. She looked at Cole. His face was the face she knew, the strong, spare, honest face that had stopped managing itself for her benefit, and was simply what it was, which was more than sufficient. He looked at her with the reverence that had replaced the contempt and the devotions that had replaced the calculation, and he held out the rope. "Ride it," he said, softly, with the same voice he used for true things. "It is yours." She set her coffee down on the porch rail and her notebook on the step, and she descended the 3 steps of her porch, the porch of her house on her land. And she took the rope from his hand. She stood beside the stallion for a moment, her hand on his neck, and she felt the animal register her presence. The slight attentive movement of recognition that a horse makes when it is deciding whether a person is worthy of its consideration. She spoke to him low, and even the same frequency she had used with the gray gelding in the storm, and the stallion's ear turned toward her, and his breathing settled. She mounted him. The experience of a great horse under a person who belongs on it is not a quiet experience. It is a conversation conducted in weight and movement and the subtle, continuous exchange of intention, and it requires the rider to bring their full, honest self to it, because the horse reads the person directly past every performance and pretense and responds to what is actually there. What was actually there on the back of the black stallion in the cold November morning was Eleanor Whitmore, all of her, the girl who had been sold, and the woman who had bought land, and the person who had held the rope and gotten up from the mud and stood on the porch and loved a man who told the truth and had built from blood money and silence and the absolute refusal to be defined by what others had decided she was a home. The stallion moved under her and she moved with him, and the sound of his hooves on the hard-packed earth of the yard was the sound of something that had been said in the auction yard being answered finally and completely in the only language that mattered. She brought him around in a wide, easy circle, the pasture and the fence line and the outbuildings and the cottonwood track all moving past her in their proper places, the geography of the thing she had made, and she brought him back to where Cole was standing. He was looking at her, only at her, with the expression of a man who has traveled a long and necessary distance and has arrived somewhere that turns out to be exactly what he did not know he was looking for. She looked down at him from the back of the horse that had been used to diminish her and was now hers. "Well," she said, and her voice in the cold morning air was the clear, quiet, undefeated voice of a woman who has finally arrived at the coordinates she spent 11 years navigating toward, and has found that they are everything she calculated and several things she did not think to put in the ledger. Cole nodded, one nod slow and certain the way he acknowledged things that were accurate. Behind them, the Black Spur Ranch moved into its Saturday morning. The hands were in the pasture. The cattle were in the good winter grass of the south field. The creek ran in its basin, and the timber ridge stood to the west, and the sky above the valley was the brilliant cold blue of a territory winter at its clearest, and the land held all of it, the way land holds everything given to it, without preference and without end. She was no longer the woman at the back of the crowd looking for a way to disappear. She was the woman on the horse, on her land, beside the man who had put his hands on the rope, and the morning was clear and cold, and entirely without reservation hers.